Jennifer, you as an anthropologist, you can for sure explain us a little bit in what are, so to speak, indigenous groups. What is the legal dimension, the social dimension? There are so many dimensions around that, because when it comes to mining worldwide, a lot of indigenous groups in particular are affected by mining.
Yeah. Well, Indigenous peoples is a global legal category. It sort of has evolved over the past several decades, and there isn't a really specific definition of what Indigenous peoples are at the global level, but there are several characteristics that Indigenous peoples tend to have. And one of the most important ones is that usually they are people that were the first occupants of a particular territory. And then other groups came in and took over that territory away, took the territory away from them, and they're colonized peoples. Another important characteristic is that they are people who have a very close relationship with the land. They usually have land-based subsistence strategies, whether it's hunting and gathering or small-scale pastoralism or shifting agriculture, for example. They are usually, or almost always, different culturally from the dominant groups in the country in which they reside. So they differ significantly culturally, have different languages, and this impacts them in a number of different ways. So they're usually much smaller groups. In some countries, they're the majority, but in the vast majority, they're smaller groups, and so they tend to be disregarded by the government. And a very important characteristic is that they themselves identify themselves as Indigenous peoples. And this category has evolved over the past few decades as Indigenous peoples have recognized each other and recognized themselves in this definition. And an important aspect of Indigenous peoples when it comes to mining operations is the aspect of collective decision making. So rather than having a majority rules type of situation, or rather than having the emphasis being based on individuals and individual rights, Indigenous peoples' rights are defined as being about the collective rights of the entire group, very often to their territory. And this has a lot of implications in terms of decision-making processes.
Thank you. So when it comes to mining, and one of your research focuses is also on Africa, and for instance, there is forced resettlement or relocation of population, is there, or major destruction of the environment and the livelihoods of indigenous groups or other local groups there. So what kind of legal instruments are there on the one hand of beyond the nation state level?
Yeah. Well, the two most important international instruments are the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, often referred to as UNDRIP or UNDRIP, and that was passed in 2007 and has been signed by almost all of the nations in the world. And so by signing this declaration, they sign on to its principles. There's also the International Labor Organization Convention 169, which was established in 1989. This is a binding instrument, but it has only been ratified by, I think, 24 countries so far, whereas the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it's not specifically binding, but it sets a standard that the countries who sign on are supposed to adhere to. And the most important principle of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is, and also the UN or the ILO Convention 169, is free, prior, and informed consent, often called FPIC. And this is a principle of Indigenous peoples' rights that is recognized at the international level, and it is the standard to which all interventions on Indigenous lands are supposed to adhere to when starting any kind of operation, whether it's a development operation or a development project or even an education project, but very specifically it applies to mining operations. And should I say a little bit more about
it would be great. What does to understand what consent means, and does that,
Yeah.
for instance, involve also a veto?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think the best way to get at this is to pick apart these 4 different aspects of free, prior, and informed consent and what do each of them mean. So first of all, you have free. And that means there is no intimidation, there's no coercion, no manipulation, and people are freely consenting to this mining operation, for example. It also means that there's no sort of manipulation in terms of positive reinforcement, like bribes, for example. So this both of these things, both negative and positive coercion happen for Indigenous peoples, very often centered around mining. So you have human rights defenders, Indigenous human rights defenders are very regularly murdered. I mean, there's over 150 murders of human rights defenders around the world in each of the last several years, and about 40% of these are Indigenous peoples, and many of them are anti-mining activists. So this element of fear, if you speak out against a mining operation, is a part of coercion that happens. So this interferes with the freedom principle of free, prior, informed consent. At the same time, you also often have mining companies offering to job creation or payment or some sort of revenue to Indigenous peoples for being in exchange for being able to set up mining operations on their territory. But that is often a form of coercion as well, because they are offered jobs, for example, but there isn't really a clear explanation of or calculation for what they're giving up. So what is offered for Indigenous peoples is usually monetary reimbursement or jobs or income, for example, where they have been depending for years upon their land, and the value of the land is not really possible to monetize. So there's no way really to compare what people are giving up in terms of what they're getting. And Indigenous peoples everywhere that they exist are among the poorest communities in their nations. I mean, especially in the global south, where their governments already have difficulty providing for all of their citizens, Indigenous peoples are at the very bottom in terms of income, for example. But income doesn't actually take into consideration the richness that they have in terms of land and resources. So this is all encapsulated in this concept of free. If people can be bought off, or if they can be made afraid enough not to resist a mine, then the consent isn't free. So, yeah, and then the free and prior, the consent also has to obviously happen before they start setting up the mining operation. And in many situations, this doesn't happen. A mine will just go in, or a mining company will go in and start, just start even looking for resources without actually consulting with the community. And then by the time the community has the chance to give their opinion about the operation, it's basically already started. So this is also another important point, that it has to be the consultation has to happen before. It has to be informed, and this means that the community has to be made aware of all of the possible ramifications of the mining operation. They have to know what are the possible health effects, how this might affect their water, how that might affect their environment, how likely it is that the mine is actually going to go forward. I mean, you also have situations where the mining operations start, and then for one reason or another, a lack of funds, or maybe they're not finding what they expected to, the mine stops, but the environmental damage has already been done. All of this information has to be provided to the community before they can actually fully consent. And then finally, we have the C of FPIC, which is consent. I've said a few times consultation now in my discussion, and consultation and consent are two different things, and it's often taken to mean free, prior, informed consultation. And their consultation does have to happen, but that's not the end of it. There has to also be consent. So the community has to say that this is what they want, not just be asked and then say no, but have it go ahead anyway, which also happens in a lot of situations. So this free, prior, informed consent is really the basis for what a mining company needs to comply with in order to start operations. And it's starting to be more recognized by mining operations around the world, but it's still, we're nowhere near the kind of adherence to this rule that needs to happen.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. This was really a great explanation of more the structural legal dimension of the whole matter. Thank you so much.
Thank you.